Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's slightly hot here. So basically, I would like to carry on where my dear colleague Ashraf Barhoum, who's the editor of Jordan's prominent English language magazine, the Jordan Times, left it about bridging the gap with the Arab world. And it's very important, if we're going to talk about bridging the gap, to understand a few key issues about the Arab world. For instance, we are talking about a region where 60 or 70% of the population is young, is under 25. You know, there might be a lot of issues in this region, but as anybody who's on social media can realize, we are very active on social media. For instance, very few people know that the largest ever consumption of YouTube videos in the whole world is in Saudi Arabia. That's the world record in Saudi Arabia. In the Emirates, in countries like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, the average person, you know, there's a 2-for-1 ratio of mobile phones. So each person has smartphones. So each person has 2 mobile phones rather than 1. I say this as an introduction to my presentation today, which is entitled From the Arab Street to the Arab Stream. As I said, it's very important to know who are we talking to in our part of the world. The Arab Street is a term I believe was coined by Western journalists who used to report on the Arab world, coming from the notion that, as we mentioned, if you were here yesterday, there is this kind of detachment between the ruling elite who in most countries are not democratically elected, and what has become known as the Arab Street. So you would hear a BBC correspondent or a CNN correspondent being asked by the anchor, so how does the Arab Street feel about this issue? How does the Arab Street feel about Palestine or Iraq? So it's become known as the pulse of the average citizen of the region. My argument is this term now needs to be updated. What now, if you want to get the pulse of the Arab world, you go to the Arab stream, i.e. you go to Twitter, you go to Facebook, you go to Instagram and see what people are talking about. So let me start by talking to you a bit about revolutions. I know here there's a lot of political science students, so this might be obvious, but it's very important for us to set a few kind of ground rules before we talk further. What we know about revolutions is that they have happened way before social media has been invented. I say this particularly because I covered the Arab Spring quite closely, and a lot of people seem to think, or certainly a lot of Western journalists kind of called it the Facebook revolution, or the Twitter revolution, or the social media revolution. Let's just be clear. Social media does not create revolutions. Social media is a tool, is an expression tool, just like writing on the wall, just like leaflets, just like secret meetings, you know, in the French revolutions, which used to happen in cafes. They cannot create a revolution on their own. They can see a very effective tool in creating revolution, in supporting revolutions such as we've seen in Egypt, or in stopping revolutions such as what we've seen recently in Turkey when President Erdogan came on FaceTime and used technology to help stop the revolutions. But I'm going to cut through the chase and tell you one thing that I've talked about, you know, that I've talked about quite often about the Arab Spring in particular. The key influencer in the success or failure, now looking back, since we have the luxury to look back about the Arab Spring, is the role of the army. So, you know, I personally believe there is no more stronger influence than the role of the army. If you look at what happened in Egypt, had the army didn't decide to side with the people in 2011, you know, we also saw people climbing on tanks, hugging soldiers. If the army decided to side with Mubarak, then Mubarak would have stayed in power. Syria, had Assad didn't have the control of the mostly Alawite army in Syria, he wouldn't have lasted in power this long. So let us kind of call a spade and understand the vital role of armies in the Arab world. Anyways, back to the presentation. Revolutions, as we all know, are not specific to one culture or one nation. And I say this very particularly because you know, one thing 2011 proved is that, contrary to concepts such as what, you know, former President George Bush used to say, that, you know, we need to export democracy to the Arab world. I think the Arab world proved that they are no more or less democratic than Europe or America. They can do it on their own. Now, whether or not it's been successful, whether or not there have been external factors that help curb these revolutions or not, that's a separate issue. The last thing we know about revolutions is that if they are successful, they will result in either a complete change from one constitution or another, example, Tunisia and Egypt, or a modification of an existing constitution, happening now, Turkey. So the revolution failed, and what's happening now is there's what we can call a counter-revolution by the current government against the people. So this is as far as we know about the revolutions. What I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of similarities. So what are the common causes behind revolutions? Why would people take to the street and vent in anger at revolution? Economic downturns. You know, we know that if people, and this is what I was trying to say yesterday in my speech, I honestly do believe when people went to the streets in Tunisia and when people went to the streets in Egypt or in Syria, it was less about, you know, being able to put that piece of paper inside the ballot box. This is a very sophisticated kind of way of thinking about it. Just think about it in terms of Maslow's pyramids of needs. You know, if you don't have food, if you don't have water, if you don't have shelter, the last thing you want to think about is having a say on, you know, things like abortion or, you know, who comes president. You will take whoever is in power as long as you can put food on the table for your children. So economic downturns are a key kind of generator of revolutions. Repressive autocratic regimes. Yes, you know, you can tolerate a repressive autocratic regime up to a certain extent, but if what happened in Syria, for example, where the presidency was inherited, and you know the rich were getting richer and the poor is getting poorer, and then something like what happened in Dar'a in early 2011, where a number of school children were taken by the authorities because they wrote, I think, kind of demeaning graffiti against the regime on the wall. So they were taken, reportedly raped, and never returned to their parents. And when their parents went to complain to the mayor of Dar'a, what he actually said is, if I were you, I would forget about your children. And if your wives cannot reproduce, send them to us and we will take care of it. Send the wives to us and we'll take care of it. So there is a certain limit to what an repressive autocratic regime can do before people decide that enough is enough. Of course, high levels of corruption and mostly blocking of expression of frustration and dissent. You know, many dictators don't realize that by allowing the media to kind of let people vent a little bit, by allowing people to express having like sort of a, you know, speaker's corner in Hyde Park, you're kind of, it's actually a safety valve for a society, because, you know, it's like, you know, the cooking pot. If there's under a lot of pressure, at one point it's going to explode. Of course, in the Arab case, all of the above applies. Sorry, do you mind if I just do this? It's slightly hot here. I'm not used to the spotlight, sorry. Yeah. So, if we know all of that is now similar to, all these similarities exist in revolutions, the question that is begs that to be answered is, what is different about the Arab revolutions? So if we know all of this is similar, does anybody have an answer? Okay, fine, it's fair enough. I know you all have an answer to this one. When we don't have an answer, what do we do these days? Yes, Google, thank you. Yes, correct answer. And Google is very, very relevant to the Arab Spring because the person that has been associated the most with the Egyptian revolution is not a poet, is not a lawyer, is not a journalist, but actually somebody that worked in Google by the name of Wa'il Ghunaim. Wa'il Ghunaim used to be based with Google in Dubai. He started a page called We Are All Khalid Saeed in memory of a blogger that his head was smashed by the security services in Egypt for posting material against the government. And, you know, Wael couldn't take it, so he started a tremendously successful page, which had a lot of following. Again, the page itself hasn't been the cause of the revolution because all of the previous background was there, but it was an area, a way for people to come around this page. And of course, Wael was, despite all his tactics to hide his identity, he was still captured when he went to Egypt by the security forces, and he became a face of the revolution. When he came out, I was actually monitoring the story, and there's this quote that is very important. When he actually came out, he said this to our channel, to Al Arabiya: "To those in power, you are facing a generation which communicates in a way you don't understand." So what does this imply? This implies two things. First of all, that there is two ways of communication. One, that there are two people communicating. There is the young generation, and there are those in power, and that there, you know, the young generation has a different way of communicating. So taking that, let's see the two different ways of communicating. First, there is the what I call the those in power way of communication. So can anybody spot any similarity between how those in power communicate? Yes, thank you. They are all, quote unquote, giving us the finger. So, so let's take the finger as an icon of how those in power communicate. And this is what I call the those in power traditional communication model. So you have the those in power and the people. Of course, those in power aren't always rational in the way they think, and they tend to lie. So how do they make sure that people do not receive any other message? Because, you know, if you repeat a lie long enough, people will eventually, well, most people will eventually believe it. You have your own or sponsored media. Of course, there might be opportunities for non-owned or non-sponsored media to do it. So how do you control the message? Is by putting a cage around the people. Now, the cage is metaphorical because it can take many shapes, ways, or forms. So it can be that, you know, if you are an editor of an independent newspaper and you say something that those in power think is not nice, you mysteriously die in a car accident the next day, you know, drink driving or whatever. Such as what happened, for example, in Libya or other countries, that in the 80s, if you were flying into the country, they will search your bag. If they find a copy of Newsweek or Time magazine, they will take it away. Of course, censorship on publications, censorships on the internet. This worked for quite a bit of time, and it meant that regimes that were in place managed to control the message and stay in power for a very long time. However, the dynamics have been changing since the 90s. Thanks mostly to satellite television and broadband. I specify broadband because the internet itself wasn't a kind of a change factor. What really was the change factor was the introduction of broadband. Think about it this way. If you were stuck in front of it, remember the old modem that, you know, used to give this fax-like sound and, you know, page would take forever to load? That is really frustrating. What kind of became the change factor is when you have direct access to information at your fingertips. Not only that, but the ability to also disseminate information. So if we were to look at the kind of things that cause change, satellite channels and social media and websites, arguably, these people managed to shake the cage that was around the populations. So for the first time, people weren't forced to watch local television in their countries telling them that this war never happened or that this country won a war when it actually didn't. People were accessing information from all over the world, from the BBC, from CNN, from Arabiya. People were sharing information on Twitter, Facebook. People were uploading their own information on Wikipedia. So essentially, it's very interesting. This didn't only remove the cage around the people. This had another effect. It's put the cage around the people in power. When you are president of Egypt for 30 years and things are going fine, and you are used to your ministers telling you everything is okay, sir. The people love you. You know, the 30,000, I don't know, 3 million people that are in the street aren't actually, although the signs are saying, you know, we hate you, get out. They're, you know, the people around him probably telling him, you know, they say they love you. So people, you know, the leadership, now it's changing. Now it's changed. Governments are becoming much more well-equipped and much more knowledgeable in using social media. I'm talking particularly about what happened in 2011 when social media took Arab governments by surprise. So technically, you can argue that this cage has now become around the people, and any attempt by the government to use traditional ways of communicating has been ridiculed by the people, by people like Wa'il Ghanem. And this is just the beginning. Of course, this is the latest report I can find. The problem with these reports is that you can never verify the numbers, but arguably there is 100 million people using the internet now in the Arab world. All we know that the numbers are certainly going to be rising. So the bottom line is the internet is going to become much more of an influencer in years to come. Right, so we talked earlier about social media not actually causing the revolution. The question is, so what did it actually do in 2011 to the extent that a lot of people actually thought that it was a social media revolution? One, people don't just watch a story or on TV or read it on paper anymore. What used to happen is you would read about a child dying from cancer, and then you'd switch off the television or put down the paper and say this is horrible and continue with your life. This has changed. Now you can go search for that child. You can start a charity online. You can collect donations from people. You can create a group on Facebook to get people around a particular cause. People have instant and on-demand access to a story or video. In London, if anybody from you in London, there's a famous saying that says, today's news is tomorrow's fish and chips. So because they used to take yesterday's newspaper and wrap fish and chips with them, and that's the end of the story. Stories these days tend to stick. Not only tend to stick, you can access them anytime. Before, you had to go to the library, get out a microfilm, look in the newspapers to find the story. Now, everything is available online at a click of a button. People interact, we've covered it, and people can compare facts and leapfrog government censorship. This is a very important point, and I think we do have an example here. Take a look at this picture from 2010. So the picture in the bottom is the real picture. This is when President Obama decided to relaunch the Arab-Palestinian peace talks. We were talking about Palestine earlier and the role of the international community. Whilst it hasn't been successful, one cannot argue that there's been several attempts to try to get people together. However, what doesn't help is things like this. So this is a picture in the White House. And we have a number of diplomats here. We all know how protocol works. In the White House, Obama is the host. Obama leads the delegation. The Egyptian state-run newspaper Al-Ahram, on the next day, photoshopped Obama to the back of the delegation and put Hosni Mubarak. And the headline was, Egypt leads the way in peace talks. And how long do you think it took people to find out? Half a day. It became viral. People were ridiculing it. And what's more ridiculous is that, Reuters or AFP went to speak to Osama Saraya, who was the editor of Al-Ahram at the time. And, the typical kind of state-owned media mentality is like, oh, no. This was not meant as a news picture. This was meant as an expressive picture to express the role Egypt plays in peace talks. Now, I've been a journalist for most of my life. Mr. Barhoum, you've been a journalist. I've never heard of the term expressive picture. In fact, when I did training at The Guardian once, I did the mistake of actually flipping the picture of somebody who was looking the other way, and I got a slap on my hand saying, you never alter pictures. So this is disastrous. And what's more disastrous is that people think that people are not going to understand or not going to know. Thus, it could be argued that when picked up by traditional media, social media, main contributor is speeding up the domino effect. Now, of course, now the number of internet users has reached 100 million per year. One of the reasons why I don't think it was a social media revolution in 2011 is if you look at Al Arabiya or Al Jazeera, the number of viewers, I'm talking about the regional dominant news channels, one of them which I work with, we get 40 million viewers a day, not 100 million users a year. So what actually happened in 2011 is, yes, people picked up the pictures of people protesting, of Mohammed al-Bouazizi, the Tunisian street vendor who put himself on fire. But it wasn't until the traditional media, until the newspapers, until the satellite channels picked up these images and broadcast them, that it created a domino effect and a copycat syndromes. So we had similar cases around the world. And then the Arab Spring happened. And of course, it became so powerful that the president of Tunisia had to step down. Now, I want to draw a parallel with something that happened recently. There's a very interesting story. I don't know if you saw it yesterday. French newspapers have decided not to publish the pictures of the terrorists in France. And I think that is a courageous step, and that is a step in the right direction. Because when you publish pictures of these people and turn them into heroes, you are only encouraging others who might feel, that they're outcast, that they might feel that nobody's paying attention. It is an easy way to become celebrities. And, of course, when you're 18 or 19, the moral judgment, the kind of assessment of facts isn't as mature as when you are older. So, that is something to consider. However, the internet is a double-edged sword, and there are several examples. I was actually, this presentation was kind of the core of a book I was writing. I was researching in 2011 about the impact of social media in the Arab world. And my initial view was social media is the best thing since sliced bread. Social media is the best thing since the invention of the wheel, because you would think that the simplistic argument that this part of the world has lived with censorship for so long, censorship has allowed these regimes to prevail, and definitely by allowing people to express themselves, we will hear the moderate, we will hear the people like the people who did in Egypt. So they started the revolution in a heartwarming exercise. After the revolution succeeded, they started tweeting and Facebooking that we now succeeded, time to go clean Tahrir Square. So you had pictures of people cleaning and tidying up the place. Unfortunately, one of the kind of sad realities in our part of the world is that technology first is condemned by extremists. So you had clerics, radical clerics, etc., saying stuff about satellite television, that they are tools of the devil, people will use them to watch pornography, and now they have their own satellite channels, they have their own networks, very influential, and mostly they have their own leadership. They kind of surpass as well government censorship. So nobody can control the poisons they kind of broadcast. Similarly, what we've seen in the internet is usage. I'm going to get to ISIS in a second because it's the obvious example, but take a look at this. So when in 12, when the US Embassy was attacked in Cairo, Ikhwan Web, which is the website for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, tweeted this heartwarming message. We are relieved that none of the US Embassy Cairo staff were harmed and hope US-Egyptian relations will sustain turbulence of Tuesday's events. So the US Embassy Cairo, in a very cheeky way, responded, thanks, by the way, have you checked out your own Arabic feed? I hope you know we read those too. Because in Arabic, they were actually blessing the attack. And in English, they were saying, we hope nobody was harmed. So again, people need to understand that, in this day and age, you cannot hide anything, and you certainly cannot have two faces. The scariest part of social media is what we're seeing now. Again, extremists start by condemning technology, by saying it is, tools of the devil, it is haram, but end up using it better than anybody else. And this is actually a quote from somebody at the RAND Corporation in a congressional hearing. Al-Qaeda leaders view communications as 90% of the struggle. And this is a very true fact. And it puts us in an awkward position if you think about it this way. So we know these extremist groups have a fascination in media, and they utilize the media to recruit, and they utilize the media to justify. In the early 2000s, it was very simple. A competitive channel of ours, who may or may not be based in Qatar, which I'm not going to name, might find a VHS tape underneath a tree. I don't know how that happens, but it happened. This tape is sent by Osama bin Laden, and they're to them only, and they put the tape on air, and it's a message from Osama bin Laden to the world. So, of course, it has done damage, but that could have been controlled, because you can pressure that channel not to publish, or they can do what we did, which is take a responsible position not to broadcast these things. What's happening now is, extremist groups are no longer mysteriously leaving VHS tapes underneath trees. They are going directly to YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. So for the past 2 years, there's been a huge pressure on social media networks, because social media networks, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., they say we are tools of democracy. We will not censor our content, people should be responsible enough to do it. Well, it doesn't apply this way because the same laws that apply for newspapers or television channels as broadcasters apply now to social media. So they're finding themselves under a lot of pressure and under a lot of lawsuits. As a carrier of this message, you carry a burden, and you are liable to the damages that happened. So, and the argument, of course, is, I've personally made this argument in several conferences. Well, we all know that you cannot post, and I'm not even going to talk about pornography. You're not going to post a topless woman picture on most social media networks before it is immediately deleted automatically, and you are sent a warning for broadcasting pornographic material. So why, my argument is, why is there always no discussion on what is considered pornographic or what is considered copyright infringement? But, we need to discuss whether or not somebody cutting the head of somebody and holding the head and the blood dripping is considered terrorism or not, because we might be infringing on somebody's freedom of expression. That was the argument for the past 2 years. From what I've read so far, there's been a lot of changes in social media networks, so hopefully they will have a more responsible approach towards terrorist content on websites. Of course, I've talked about how this puts us under pressure. So now we can take a responsible decision not to carry an ISIS video in our newsroom or not to broadcast a message from Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But the honest truth is, it really doesn't matter anymore because these people are going directly to social media. Final word, just in case, before you ask me any questions, in case you think I know what I'm talking about, there is actually nobody in the world that can tell you exactly what the impact of the internet is. These are not my words, these are the words of Eric Schmidt, who all know was the CEO of Google. Check this out. The internet is the first thing that humanity has built that humanity doesn't understand. It is the largest experiment in anarchy that we've ever had. And to end on a lighter note about the things we cannot expect from the internet, who would have thought that after the 2011 Egyptian revolution, an Egyptian decided to call his daughter Facebook? So thank you very much, and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abbas, for the brilliant presentation.
Thank you. Sorry I took too long.
It was very interesting, amazing. Now it's time for your comments and questions, please.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it really interesting. My name is Nicolás Pamontojo and I come from Spain. And I was wondering, with your metaphor you used about the cage, about taking people out of the cage thanks to social media, and I sometimes see it the other way. The social media is actually getting us more into the cage. As the most evident example is the Facebook feed. Facebook feed is based on what you like, what you have liked previously, what your friends like, and it actually, you live in a kind of an information bubble. For example, if I vote left or I vote right, I will only see posts from leftist newspapers or from my friends who are also from the left. And can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And my question is, well, who knows? And my question is, what do you think we can do to solve this bubble problem? I mean, do you think we should go back to the streets? We should maybe listen again to the media outlets, or that we are condemned in a way to live in this bubble for as long as we have social media? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's actually a very interesting point you raised. Let me just say this. This presentation is true as of 2011, okay? The problem is, and this is exactly why I stopped writing my book, because I realized by the time it is published, things are going to change, and people are going to say, this guy doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. And this is the sad reality. You know, if you look at everything, before, you used to live, for example, with video players. You used to live with Betamax or VHS for 25 years, 30 years before something has changed. Now, technology is changing every 6 months. So at that time, there was no controlled feed on Facebook. Now, Facebook decided that we need to monetize our operation. So one way to making money is that if you want to ensure your message gets to all your followers, you need to pay us a certain amount of money. Now that creates a bubble, you are right. And then, you know, there's always, I get invited to talk at conferences about traditional media versus new media and who's gonna kill who, and you know, nobody's gonna kill anybody, but there is a key point to distinguish between the two. When we talk about traditional media, newspapers, etc., let me take, for example, the British examples, like The Guardian. There is a board of trustees. There is a ruling set of principles that applies to that you can challenge, that you can take to court, that you can, you know, get somebody fired. But when we're dealing with robots, with algorithms, and you know, they think that, okay, this person has previously searched for Maldives, that Bermudas, snorkeling equipment, then he must be interested in diving, etc. So all your feed suddenly becomes diving. I personally worry what kind of humans, because we as humans are shaped by our environment. So I personally think that we are risking having people with one-track minds. There's actually, I'll get you after the presentation, I can get you the details because they're not on me, but there's actually one university in America that is actually studying the impact of social media on people's behavior. And they're experimenting with real people that if they alter their feed, how can we make them nicer or meaner people? So what you're talking about is actually happening, and there's a lot of people concerned. I personally think that we should burst this bubble. We should not allow robots to decide what is better for us and what isn't, because we will be kind of, honestly, like Eric Schmidt said, we will be kind of venturing to the unknown.
Question?
Thank you for your presentation today. You know, I get kind of nervous when a person like yourself, a journalist, kind of supports censorship. The question is, some people sit in a room somewhere and they decide for the vast majority of people what they can and cannot see, implying that they themselves know what's best for the others, for the vast majority. I've given nobody any permission to keep any information away from me personally. And I oppose any such move. If we look at the history of journalism, in the main, it has been a craft that was dealing with the exposure of a system, of a kingdom, of a government, of a society. The history is replete with those kind of examples. So you don't, for instance, you have a person who's suspected of a terrorist act, and people decide, well, we're not going to make him a hero and show his picture, but there might be somebody out there who recognizes him. It's only in America, if you're one of the most wanted, your picture is in every post office. Everyone, without any discussion about that. I think it's dangerous to, some kind of way, you know, like, make the question of censorship legitimate in that way. I reject it. I'm a journalist myself. And I think that a freedom of information and freedom to be able to discern what is correct, what's incorrect, is something that a society, a civilized society, should be able to handle. And especially if you're talking about those kind of issues, you know, the question of, should we show a face? Should we, did they have an announcement they wanted to make? I want to know what the hell is happening. Yes, you know, I don't want to promote them, and certainly there is a way to adjudicate all of that.
Well, good point, and you're obviously not the first one to raise it, and I just want to clarify, I never said that I endorse censorship, but there is a big difference between freedom of expression and outright calls to commit a crime. So arguably, if you are making an outright call to make a crime and somebody implement it, then you share part of the burden. Now, the issue with your question is, well, with your point that you're trying to make is, I never said governments should be watching what's happening on social media. You're very right that when somebody is wanted, they put their pictures, but that they put in every post office. That belongs to a certain time. We are now, as I've just demonstrated, social media has a tremendous impact which dwarfs what used to happen before. It is causing things that are out of control. My point of saying, and whether you like it or I like it or not, censorship is happening. The same argument you made can be made about pornography on the internet. It can be made about copyrighted material. All I'm saying is, how come there is no discussion about these things, but we suddenly remember freedom of expression and human rights when there's somebody slaughtering somebody on a social media network, his blood is dripping, and children are watching it, people up waking in the morning, not finding their children, only to realize they're blowing themselves up in Baghdad or in Syria. That, my friend, is something that we need to think about. I'm afraid I don't have the answer to, but it is something that is worth asking.
Next question.
As I said, the internet is the biggest experiment in anarchy that people have ever dwelt on.
Well, it sounds cute, but I don't agree.
Well, I'm glad you think it sounds cute.
Thank you. I would just like to continue that and asking, in that case, yeah, we understand all that, but how children have to deal with that and how education has to deal with social media if there can be this positive and that negative effect?
Absolutely. Education, as I said yesterday, is a very, very important topic because a lot of what we're learning today in schools might not apply to the world we're currently living in or will be soon living in. So, like the question about the bubble, what if somebody wants to find information that the algorithms or the robots decide he's not interested in? The beauty of what was the newspaper at some point is, whether or not you like the editorial board of that newspaper, but you arguably think that these people are graduates, these people have experience, these people subscribe to a certain code of conduct. So you pick up the newspaper, yes, you might go directly to the sports page because you're interested in sports, but you will also find news that is important from other parts of the world or other parts of the city or other topics that you are interested in. The fear, and going back to the question about the bubble, is this will no longer apply because the algorithm is going to decide what you like and what you don't like, and you might find yourself, if you're not equipped with the right tools, not knowing a lot of what's going on in the world. So again, I am afraid I don't have the answer directly, but I fear that the missing link is somewhere in the educational system. Like people in universities in their freshman year or people in high school were taken to the library and taught how to search for certain books using different referencing, etc. I think at some point in the very near future, we need to be able to kind of teach people how to become literal in terms of searching and in terms of finding information which the algorithm might decide not to show you.
I want to disagree with you when you took that frame from the people and put it on the government. Because what happened in Egypt was a shock and very exceptional, and then all governments woke up, and now what's happening that government use this social media more than people use, and they have a lot of advanced plans to control that. And especially I'm talking because I'm from Afghanistan, and I see Pakistani side, they are using Facebook IDs and using the ethnicity problems between inside Afghanis. We have different ethnicities. So they are using social media to widen that gap between ethnicities and keep Afghanistan burning. So what are you going to do about that? Like, do you still think like social media has a big impact when all governments is now using social media to control people?
Thank you for the question. As I said to your colleague, the presentation applies to a certain period of time, which was 2011. At that time, governments, or at least Arab governments, had no idea how to deal with social media. As I said in the presentation, this has changed. So this no longer applies. Governments now have secret accounts. They have what in Twitter terms are called eggs, which is unidentified users who suddenly you find 20,000 people tweeting the same thing or saying the same thing. So it has changed. What I can say about social media is, just so that I'm clearly understood, I'm not saying it is a force for the bad, but I'm also saying it's not a force necessarily for the good. Like any technology, it depends on how people use it. And hopefully, to bring it back to education, with the proper courses, with the proper kind of knowledge introduced, we would be able to kind of control this social media and make sure it does not fall in the hands of terrorists. Because if you are a terrorist and you are inciting for crime, then I simply think there should be no tolerance for intolerance. Unfortunately, the reality of this world is people who are opposed to democracy, the biggest enemies of democracy, end up being the people that benefit the most out of democracy.
Yes. Sorry. You've talked a lot about the importance of social media to collect information for users. What about collecting information about the users by the secret services all around the world? For example, the face recognition through the selfie posted on Facebook or other possibilities. All those databases collected from the social media about the users of the social media.
It's a very, very good point. And I believe there are laws, and particularly now that we're in Germany, I think the European Union is very sensitive towards this matter, and it has problems with Google. Ironically, somewhere down the line, we eliminated the need for these companies or governments to spy on us by voluntarily giving them our age, who were we married to, who are our children's names, what are our mother's name, where do we spend our holidays, what are our hobbies, what movies are we into, what communities are we into, and people are doing this voluntarily. So again, to bring it back to education, I think, just as if, when you buy a packet of cigarettes, there's a warning message on it that, smoking kills. I don't think there's enough precaution being made about the impact, the long-term impact of social media. You might have heard of something in the UK, which is the right to be forgotten. And governments, on behalf of people, is lobbying for your cache, your kind of search history to be removed, because who knows how this information can be used in the future. So it's a very sensitive topic, and again, it is still something that is being developed.
I would like to make just a brief comment. It's not a question at all about what said my colleague Nicolas and the person from Afghanistan. Both of you are right, okay? And of course, he is right as well. I mean, everything is relative. Nothing is absolute at the end. And he said that this presentation was focused on 2011. And yeah, it's what happened with social media. I mean, in 2011, I think let's say the old generation, they didn't have any control of the social media, and after they had to learn it, because this is how they were the human beings, right? We have to adapt to the environment at the end. It's just a parallelism, for example, what happened, I think it was in the 325 in the Roman Empire. They were under a big, huge revolution, and they had a big tool, fighting against the Roman Empire, that it was Christianism, the Christian philosophers, what they did, to survive. I think it was the imperator in 325. If you cannot with the enemy, join the enemy. They approve the Roman Empire, they adapt some tools, the tools that the others were using, and they survive a little bit more. But you cannot survive forever at the end. So nothing is forever. So yeah, it was just this comment.
I think you know much more about the topic than I do. Yeah, I do. Anything else?
Thanks very much. My name's Gemma Turnbull. I'm from the UK. sorry everyone for Brexit. You've mentioned, and a few people have mentioned, that Brexit was a demonstration of the complete loss of critical thinking from people in the UK in terms of being given fabricated information and not really doing anything about it to check whether it was valid or true and actually think about what the implications for it would be. And you've mentioned that sort of preparing people for the skills to use social media and the internet, there needs to be education about how to search effectively for information. But one thing I've noticed post-Brexit result is that a lot of people's responses have been to complain about the fact that politicians lied, and then to say that the response we need is to set up some kind of independent commission that fact checks what politicians are saying for everyone, rather than people taking responsibility for sort of actually doing their own searching and doing their own critical thinking. So in addition to sort of equipping people with the skills to engage with social media and the internet, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on how to generate a culture change where people take responsibility for what they are absorbing and how they're responding to that information when they find it.
Thank you for your question. First of all, I think nobody can blame you for Brexit. It's the people who are saying things like, well, I don't care if we leave the European Union because I don't like Chinese food anyway. Or people who are saying, you know, Brexit is a way to stop Muslims coming into the country. Now, the problem isn't that these people believe that. The problem is that they were led to believe that. And as far as your point about setting up a body that fact checks what politicians says, well, this body has been invented centuries ago. It's called journalism. It's called the fourth estate. The problem is if you pick up the Sun, which is, I don't know if you were here yesterday, but I mentioned this example. The Sun is the biggest tabloid and it's the most influential newspaper in the UK. It sells around 3 million copies in print, and it is the most influential, yes. It's a sad reality, it's sad, but it's true. So 3 million copies circulated, and as well as online. Front page story, the Queen endorses Brexit. It was not true. The palace came out and denied it and sent a complaint to the Sun. The source that arguably was quoted denied it, but the damage was done. And the Sun continues to sell 3 million copies a day. And, versus people in the BBC who are the more responsible, more moderate, being fair and balanced is about giving everybody a right to speak. So even if somebody is lying. Now, there has been a lot of, challenging for the BBC, saying, well, you did not do enough to challenge those who were, lying. Nobody's denying anybody's right to kind of express their point of views, but your job as a journalist is to bring them here and say, well, hold on, you lied about the number of immigrants. You lied about what these immigrants are taking away from British people. You lied about the contributions that these immigrants are doing to this country. And that didn't happen. And unfortunately, there's twofold. So there is, there's this, in democracies, there's a system of checks and balances. So the fourth estate, the media, keeps the politicians at check. The people, assuming they are educated, keep the media at check. If you look at what happened in, what's happening currently in America, what's happening in the UK, and these are countries that we look up to as countries that have a tradition in democracy, that countries that have a long experience in democracy. Unfortunately, something went wrong with the education. And people are no longer holding the media accountable, and the media is not holding politicians accountable. How on earth does Nigel Farage get to come up and say the very next day after Brexit, oh, we don't actually have a plan, and that pledging the 350 million euros to go to the NHS was a mistake? Well, too late, but, and then what does he do? He resigns and says, I want my life back. If there wasn't something wrong with the education and wasn't something wrong, these people, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, should go down the same line as Tony Blair for misleading the government or misleading people. And there's actually there's actually a court case proceedings anyway. 1,000 lawyers in the United Kingdom have written a letter to the government notifying them that it would be illegal to trigger Article 50 based on 3 grounds. First of all, the referendum, when it was approved by Parliament, was non-binding. Second of all, that under the European Referendum Act, you need to achieve 60% of majority to be able to act upon the referendum. And third of all, which is the most important part, the promises, the grounds that were set by the Leave campaign were misleading. As such, you need to stop and investigate the misleading campaigns. It's the same way as if you go to a doctor and he misleads you to thinking that you're ill to sell you medicine, that doctor's license will be confiscated. The question is, why don't we do the same thing with politicians? Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Abbas.